So there are 4 points that I'm going to talk about today that I think every literacy plan should include. The first one is find ways to connect school literacy to the multiple literacies of students. And we're going to talk about each one of these, and you'll have time to process each of these points. Enhance the content knowledge of students and integrate literacy and learning. Know what a literacy-rich school looks like and establish a school vision. And assess your school on several dimensions to set goals and focus energy. And we'll talk about each one as we go through. So I retired from Florida State University 3 years ago, but in my last 5 years, I got a grant from the Carnegie Foundation, and the Carnegie Foundation, as you may or may not know, has done a lot of work in adolescent literacy. And so I was charged with finding out how to put together not necessarily the classroom implementation of improving literacy, but a school-wide literacy process. So at the last handout in the electronic handouts is a flyer for 3 books. The first one is Taking Action on Adolescent Literacy, in which we developed this model. And so we call it the Taking Action Literacy Leadership Model. And then the second book is called Meeting the Challenge of Adolescent Literacy. And the third book is this one I brought along, and don't let me forget, I'm going to give it away before we finish today. And this is called Taking the Lead on Adolescent Literacy. And the last page of the handouts on the website has a flyer for all, so you'll have all the titles. But this is a book that lays out a step-by-step process for developing, implementing, and sustaining a literacy action plan in your school. So you may want to get that book, but I want you to know that much of what I'm going to talk about today comes from the first book and this book in terms of, and you can use any of the tools that I hand you today and implement them in your own way if you would like. The leadership model begins with where literacy happens for students. So it starts with student motivation, engagement, and achievement, which of course is the bullseye of the model. It happens across the content areas, in literacy interventions, with school environment, parents and community, and district. Inside the model are what we call action points. And these action points are what needs to happen for this literacy plan to operate, and they need to be considered, but these action points are not linear in any way. They're recursive, and they happen simultaneously. So implement a literacy action plan, support teachers to improve instruction, use data to make decisions, build leadership capacity, and allocate resources. So this is the Taking Action Literacy Leadership process that all of the work is taken from. When I talk about we, I'm generally talking about my colleagues in the National Literacy Project. So I formed this nonprofit about 15 years ago, and we have spent 15 or 20 years working in different schools around the country, and we collectively came up with this model and this process for developing, implementing, and sustaining a literacy action plan. We're a nonprofit, we're not a program, we don't have anything to sell but our services, and this is all we do. So that's when I talk about we, it's my colleagues and myself in this team. If you were born between 1600 and 1900, the only definition for literacy would be the ability to sign your name or to own or borrow books. And as you can see, as the years went by, the definition of literacy was how many years of schooling you had until about the late 1970s, when literacy was defined by having a high school diploma. As you know, literacy has changed over the years and become much more complex to include lots and lots of different types of literacy. Here's some literacy that you might recognize. Hair for school events, before a test, after school, right before lunch, right after lunch, for going home, and for playing. How I feel about 6th grade. I think 6th grade is very fun, but sometimes it can be a real pain. I made the honor roll, so my mother said I handled the transaction real well. If you don't know what that is, that's going from 5th grade to 6th grade. I would not trade 6th grade for anything except for no school at all. I was real scared about PE. I thought we would have to climb poles, but my teacher, all he makes us do is dress out and then we just talk. One good thing is getting your own locker, no free play. This year at the middle school has been fun. The middle school is a hard learning place to be. They have some of the hard teaching teachers, especially Mr. Thomas, my homeroom teacher. I have had a lot of experience this year at the middle school that I have never had at school, like harder subjects. Here's a concept map about 6th grade. Middle school is weird. All you do is work, work, and more work. I know it'll be a lot harder in the real world. I want to know where kids think they are, if they're not really in the real world. But are we really going to use music, art, and PE? All these classes teach you is how to draw, comprehend music, and be athletic. Are we really going to use this stuff? It's useless, unwanted, and unneeded. Oh yeah, referrals need to stop. The school thinks we should act like adults, but we're kids for crying out loud, not adults. These are some of the things that make middle schools weird. So I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then I'm going to ask you to process and talk to each other a little bit. And since we're such a large group, I'm going to ask you to summarize your conversations and then raise my hand. So if you see my hand up, if you would help me out so that we can bring the attention back here, that would be really helpful. So I'd like for you, with your colleagues, to think about and talk about what do your kids talk about outside of school, and what do they read outside of school? Take a minute and do that, please. So middle school kids outside of school read all of these things, right? And we often say that kids don't read anything. But what we mean by that is that they don't read our stuff. And our stuff happens to be narrative and expository. But they read all the time. Even your less proficient readers do this kind of reading. So the question I have for you is, how do you connect their outside of school reading with the inside of the school reading? And so what we talk about is narrative and expository. What do kids read most of in the elementary grades? Narrative stories. What do they read most of when they get to middle school? Expository. Science, social studies, technical. Who helps kids read the expository text that they meet every day? Should be the content teachers. Here's what you get when you're on a faculty. They go like this. And so the English language arts people say, well, the social studies and science people must do that because they do that kind of text. And social studies and science people say, well, don't English language arts people do that because they do words? We do concepts. And oftentimes in a middle school, nobody really takes responsibility for teaching kids about all the different kind of texts that there's seats over here if you want to come on over. All the different kinds of texts that kids meet during the day. So they read a technical, come on over here. Nobody will notice. And so every teacher needs to take responsibility for teaching them how to tackle the text that will make them successful not only in school, but outside school as well. This was a bulletin board in Chicago, and this teacher did a really fantastic job of saying, okay, here's a math book. Math books have a text, looks different than a poem, but how do you go about reading that math book? How do you go about reading a train schedule? How do you go about reading a magazine? So all these multiple literacies of kids, teachers need to take the responsibility to talk to kids about the structure of the text, the way it looks, and how you go about reading that different kinds of text. All right, so take a minute and talk to your neighbor about how you can find ways within your middle school day of connecting school literacy to the multiple literacy of students? Does anybody have any suggestions of connecting the school literacy with the multiple literacies of young adolescents? Yep.
So one of the things I did when I was still teaching 7th grade, I was teaching the skill of summarization, and I was using the book The Outsiders as the conduit I used to teach the standards. And I had my students take out their cell phones and they had to summarize chapter 4 of The Outsiders, which they had read, and then they texted the summarization to my daughter in Chicago, and I was telling these guys, it happened to be October 12th, which was Columbus Day, and my first period class met at 7:30 in the morning, so it was 6:30 in Chicago, on her day off, and she's like, Mom, what is PB and J? I said, well, Honey, Boy, and Johnny, I mean, everybody knows that, right? And so she selected the top 3 summarization, and then she texted back, and then the class voted on which one and why.
Yes.
Why that made it the best summarization.
Well,
They loved it, and they learned it for life.
Yes, right. And you connected with a literacy that they're familiar with, right. The second point I'm going to talk about is the relationship between literacy and learning, the relationship between content knowledge and the process of literacy learning. And I'm going to do that by, I have a tape of a 14-year-old 8th grade boy, and he's reading a passage, which is a 5th grade passage called Space Pet. It's a diagnostic setting, not an instructional one. So he was asked to read it out loud, and he was told that if he came across a word he didn't know, just to guess at it because I wasn't going to supply it. Now, you would never do that in an instructional setting, not let somebody read something ahead of time. But when you have kids read text cold, you can assess what strategies they're using that are effective and which ones are not. And the other thing I'd like for you to think about is, what is the relationship for middle school kids between oral reading and silent reading? This tape brings out a couple of important points. So let's listen to Jim read this story about Space Pet. Hopefully.
As far as I know, has never been a rule against pets in space station. We just had never had any pets until several people brought them, I guess. He wanted to know for us figure out why he crossed the pet he did, choose the pet he did.
Why is he having difficulty with the name Sven? That's certainly an unfamiliar word, spelling, etc. And so he says, I just never had any pets until several people brought him, I guess. And then he said why he cost the pet he did, choose the pet he did. Is it a good thing for readers to go back and correct what they've read? Yes, it shows that they're thinking about what they're reading, and it shows that they're engaged in metacognition. They're trying to make sense of it. But it's not fluent, right? So it doesn't sound fluent when readers go back and correct. So is fluency good? Yes, fluency is good because the more fluent you are, the more attention you have in your head to comprehend. But I would submit that there's a difference between oral reading fluency and silent reading fluency, and think about the difference as we go along. Questions or comments before I go on?
I first saw Carby, I guess, when I was working in my office. I heard a musical whistle near my ear and thought it had come over the radio. I wanted for the news too. Following interest, there was a lovely song. I looked up and I had my first look at Kirby, a kid.
Which is a more serious mistake, saying several for Sven or Kirby for Clarabelle? Several for Sven because it changes the meaning of the whole sentence and the whole passage, doesn't it? Does it really matter if this guy's name is Kirby, Clarabelle, or Clarence? He never does get Clarabelle. But you can tell that he's substituting a name for a name. So if he was reading silently, would it matter? Here's another example. I looked up and had my first look at Kirby, I guess. That does not look like that sentence, right? Does it change the meaning? If he were reading silently, would it matter? Here is a serious mistake. I wanted for. That's just not working for him. Of all the words in the English language, why would he say wanted for waited? They look similar, right? They look the same. They have the same configuration.
She was a small yellow holding very still in the air. Her wings were folded quietly at her side. She could not stand the way because nothing had any weight in space before the, I don't know what that word is, seeing a coordinating, I don't know, in our space station. She didn't a kind of backward loop, no earthborn, could have done it. No earthborn creature could have done it.
Creature's better, right? Is he ever going to get the word canary? Does he know what a canary is? How many, if we would have said to Jim, you're going to read a story about a small yellow bird called a canary and why they took this canary into a space station, do you think he'd have a better sense of what he's reading about? Do you think he'd be more fluent? How many times do we give kids assignments and say, go home and read pages 28 to 32 tonight, it's about the House of People of Nigeria. Here's Nigeria. And even if they read it, if they don't have a file folder for that concept, they're not going to understand it. So I'm a big proponent of pre-reading strategies. Help kids understand what they're reading about so that they have a schema to attach it to. So what grade level do you think he's reading on? This is a 5th grade passage.
In no time at all, several pets was everybody's pet. We had a little trouble hiding her when important guests came to visit the space station. When couldn't be sure if we were breaking any rules. We had her there, but we liked her too much to take a chance in losing her. Kirby, right away got nosy. We when we hit her. Sometimes we had to think of a fast explanation in peeps and whistles that came from the outer place, I guess, that where we had a few narrow escapes, but then who would ever dream of looking for a canary. There it is, canary in a space station. Yeah, that's what that word was.
And then he says, and that's what that darn word was. So he finally does get it. How does he get the word canary? Peeps and whistles through context, through initial sound, and I will tell you that the rest of the reading is much more fluent, and you can tell that he's comprehending, and it's not as halting, because now he knows what he's reading about. The next thing I asked him to do was to tell me a little bit about his father and his uncles went out hunting a lot. He was from Indiana, and he had a gun collection. His father had a gun collection. And so I knew he was interested in guns and hunting and such, and so I said, tell me about some of the guns that your dad has in his collection. And he's not reading this, but he's just telling me about it.
Hawkins had a heavy barrel on it, but really what that was used good for was the mountain men. We kept getting knocked off their horses by trees and stuff, and the stocks kept breaking on them or break a barrel or something. They had to have a gun heavy enough and sturdy enough to really go out and knock down some of this North American big game like grizzly and moose and stuff. And the little 45 caliber Kentucky flintlock wasn't heavy enough, and it was too long to navigate through brush and thick undergrowth, so they had to have a gun heavy enough and short enough to get the job done.
Well, he was reading Space Pet. Did you think he would know the word caliber? He actually starts with maneuver and ends up with manavigate, which I think is a pretty cool word. So he's got a sense of history, got a sense of geography, and his vocabulary is a lot better than we initially might have thought it, right? Okay, the next thing I asked him to read, cold by the way, is a code book of when you can use firearms during what season, and it's written at a 12th grade level.
Legal weapons, 12 gauge, 16 gauge, and 20 gauge shotgun loaded with slugs and flintlocks or percussion cap muzzle loaders. This is a 44 caliber or larger load with single ball, split or corrugated bullet. Means like a mini ball. One deer only may be taken by person during a firearm season with a shotgun or muzzleloader rifle, and it must be a buck, male buck, with a legal long antlers, these 3-inch long prongs.
So did you think that he would be able to read fluently caliber, gauge, percussion capped muzzle loader? And this actually was not in the text, means like a mini ball, but he stopped to explain it to me because he didn't think that I would know that that was a split or a corrugated bullet that they used in the Civil War. So what's his reading level? Do you have any Jims? You have Jims, don't you? Who, when they're reading school stuff, falter and sound like they are on, and he wouldn't even do very well on a standardized test, would he? No, he's not going to do well on any kind of standardized test. He's going to come out about 3rd grade level. Okay, so I'd like you to talk to your neighbor about what you would do to help Jim. This half of the room, you have been given the gift of Jim in your content area classroom. Social studies, science, language arts. What are you going to do to help Jim be successful in your content area classroom? This section of the room, you are his reading teacher. What are you going to do to help him become a better reader? Talk to your neighbor about that, if you would, please. Okay, content area teachers, what are you going to do to help Jim become a better, more successful reader in your content area? Preview the vocabulary. Do a pre-reading strategy so he knows what he's reading about. Also, I think Jim would be a really, well, all kids would benefit from, but Jim especially, from a text talk. Here's a social studies textbook. See these two headings? They're going to be the major ideas. See that bold-faced word? That's going to be a concept it's a major concept you really need to pay attention to. See this italicized word? So that he can see the structure of the text that he's expected to read. Reading teachers, how are you going to help him become a better reader? Speak up.
Get him interested in some text that's like slightly above his level, so he's interested, but then he's also expanding his vocabulary. And then when he gets to one of those words he doesn't know, have him highlight it, but then when you're working with him, work on those word attack skills, because he couldn't, there's like easy words in there that have, multi-syllable words, but he could not hunk and chunk it, he could not break it up for the life of him.
Right.
And like it's first grade level word parts, but he could not take it apart. And that's going to help him in the content areas when he gets to those 4 or 5 syllable words that mean big things to help him understand. So
Jim also needs to read. And you were mentioning reading something. I think he could read Hatchet independently. 5th grade level, in his interest area, and then because he won't become more fluent unless he does read. And so if he finishes Hatchet, then maybe he can read another Gary Paulson book that's a little more challenging. But he also needs to have his interest expanded to include those kinds of things, and I think pre-reading strategies might do that for him if you can connect. Well, all kids need to see the connection between what they're learning in school and what their daily life is. So Jim is one kind of struggling reader. Another kind of struggling reader is a girl I call Stephanie, and she can pronounce any word in the dictionary, but nothing goes through her head. And so she doesn't sound like she's got a reading problem because she's fluent, but she doesn't have any comprehension skills. And her teachers think she can read because she sounds good. And her parents think she can read because she sounds good. And she always volunteers to read, but if you ask her a question, then she can't answer it. And she has trouble with silent reading comprehension because she is not connecting with comprehension. The third kind of struggling reader is someone that doesn't have the experience base that Jim does. They haven't been out much. Their parents don't talk to them much. They have a very low concept base. And they're probably the most difficult to work with because they need so much. They need explanations about things. They need words, concept words explained to them. So not all struggling readers are the same. But knowledge base is a key to becoming a proficient reader. So there was a study that was conducted, it's called the baseball study. And here's the reference if you would like to look it up. There were 4 groups. They divided kids into 4 groups. This is a middle school group. Group 1 had high reading ability and high knowledge of baseball. Group 2 had high reading ability and low knowledge of baseball. So here's the low. Group 3 had low reading ability with high knowledge of baseball. And group 4 had low reading ability with low knowledge of baseball. So they're going to read about baseball. Which group does the best? Group 1, high knowledge of baseball, high reading ability. Which group does the worst? 4, predictable. What's not predictable is which group comes in as a close second? Group 3. Because even though they have low reading ability, they have a high knowledge of baseball. So that's like Jim filling in the holes with his own concept base. So when you're putting together a reading plan or a literacy plan, it's easy for the content teachers to feel disenfranchised and not included. Are content teachers important in the literacy process? Absolutely. And this is kind of proof of the pudding that kids cannot become better readers without some accompanying knowledge base. So I would ask you to include in your plans, how are you going to connect literacy and learning together, which includes the role of your content teachers. So take a minute and talk to your neighbor about, when you're thinking about a literacy plan, how are you going to enhance content knowledge of students and integrate literacy and learning? So how do we get there? How do we get to this literacy and learning point? I gave away all my handouts, so I don't have any in front of me, but this model is, we're going to talk about how to implement a plan, and we're going to spend some time on the different stages of implementing this plan. And I'm going to take you through two pieces that I think you can go back immediately and work with your faculty with. So developing, implementing, and monitoring a literacy action plan takes some conversation, takes some planning. It doesn't happen with two people sitting in their office and coming up with a plan and presenting it to the faculty. It happens when you interact with the faculty, get their feedback, their honest feedback, incorporate that honest feedback, and it becomes a school-wide living document. So these are the five. The second handout, which is on the website, not what I handed out, has these 5 steps. Get your literacy improvement effort underway. And then there's 3 steps underneath that. Establish a literacy team. I don't have that in front of me because I gave it away. And assess the vision and create a vision for your school. Then we'll move on to conduct a school-wide assessment, develop a plan, and we'll spend less time on these two because that has to do, while it's a important part of your process, I suspect that most of you right now are more interested in the getting to the point of developing a literacy action plan, right? I gathered that because I heard this morning that these plans are due March 1st. Oh, March 2nd. That's right around the corner. You probably knew that, didn't you? Okay. One of the handouts I handed out and was on the website is a vignette for a literacy-rich school. So if you can get next to somebody that has that, and you might have to share or read it electronically, it'll take about 10 minutes to read. And it is not a case study, it's a vignette, which means it's not a real school, but every single thing in this school we saw in a school somewhere. So what I'd like you to do is read about the literacy-rich middle school and underline the structures, the policies, and the processes that that school has put in place to make it literacy-rich. So underline them, make a list of them, but capture in some way what makes this school literacy rich, and do it individually, and then we'll talk about it with your row mates. So what are some things that are in place in this middle school that make it literacy rich?
It's a whole school effort. It's a whole school effort.
It's a whole school effort, yes. And in order for you to have a successful literacy plan implemented, it has to be a whole school effort. And all of you have rock star teachers in your school that do a great job with moving kids with literacy, whether in the content area or intervention teachers. What happens if they get pregnant or move to Istanbul? Your literacy plan cannot be dependent on the rock star teachers. It's got to be everybody in the school. And somebody in the session this morning said, how do you get teachers like that? You don't go out and pick them off trees. You grow them. They are in your schools now, and you grow them so that they can become supporters of literacy. And, in education, you take what you get and move them as far as you can. And that's, you're not going to go out and get new students, and you're not going to go out and get new teachers. You work with what you have to make your school as literacy rich as possible. What else struck you about this vignette? Ownership of the policies and the practices and the procedures. What else?
The PD revolved around literacy with their contract.
Their professional development revolved around their literacy plan throughout the whole day. And so, like I said, this is not a case study. This is not a real school, but we've seen these practices in lots of schools across the country. So it is possible. So it just is a matter of putting in those policies and then making sure it becomes part of somebody's job descriptions, so that then that is part of the way you do things around the school. Okay? Now, so you've read the vignette. What some people do is, one of the ways that we have worked with them is we work with them in a literacy team and actually chart out what looks like literacy rich, and then the literacy team can take it to grade levels or to departments or whatever and have the same conversation, so that you begin to talk about what does a literacy rich school look like, and so that everybody in the school building knows what a vision for a literacy rich school looks like. And so the question becomes, how do you have those conversations? And how do you're welcome to use this vignette or any of the other ones. We also have vignettes for individual departments. So if you're having a little difficulty with the language arts department getting on board, you can use a vignette about what does literacy rich instruction look like in language arts or social studies or science or math. And sometimes some teachers need to have those conversations around content because that's where they live before they can talk about a whole school implementation. So spend a moment talking to your neighbor about this. If your vision for a literacy rich school, in your vision for a literacy rich school, what would the students be doing? What would the teachers be doing? What would the environment in the classroom look like? And what would the environment in the whole school look like? Take a minute and talk about that if you would, please. So having these conversations not only on the literacy team, but also with departments, with grade levels, with different groups, is a very healthy thing to do because it helps people see what a literacy-rich school looks like and what is possible. So somebody this morning asked, how do you get there? What do you do? A, you have to have strong leadership that's committed to literacy. Let me tell you about Kevin. Kevin is a middle school teacher in St. Petersburg, Florida. And Kevin, when you do a workshop in Kevin's school, he sits in the back and he'll say, now, Judy, what were those 3 points again? And you say, support strategies in the classroom, know who your students are, use whatever. And so you go through your 3 classes. Just one more time, could you say those 3 things? So he's always there saying, I'm paying attention, and he's at every session. And then he does walkthroughs, and he looks for those 3 things. And when he finds one of those 3 things, he writes it up in a newsletter or electronic newsletter that he sends out to everybody and say, by the way, if you have time, stop by Mrs. Jones's class because she did a wonderful job of a triple Venn diagram and helping kids compare and contrast before they write. So he really gets literacy. And when the kids are standing in the hall waiting for their picture to get taken, he walks by with a cart that says, here's a magazine I think you would like. And he has a sign in his office that says, and he gets donated magazines from the parents, and he has a sign in his office that says, I'm sorry if you have to wait, but if you have to wait, please help yourself to a magazine, and if you don't finish it, please take it home. Everything in that school is about literacy, and he gets literacy. He can walk into any classroom and do a literacy support lesson for teachers. And so that's what I'm talking about, is it has to have strong leadership. Secondly, you have to have a plan. You have to have some kind of plans with measurable, attainable goals. And you have to have some group in the school, a literacy team, an administrative team, a leadership team. Whatever you have already in place is fine, as long as they say that part of their responsibility is to look at the literacy improvement in the school. So leadership, a plan, and some group that is in charge of literacy improvement in the school. Take just a minute and talk about what you're going to do in the school to build this vision of literacy. What steps are you going to take? So you have a sense of what a literacy-rich school looks like, how it behaves, that it's school-wide, and now you've talked a little bit about what you're going to do in your school to develop this vision for a school-wide literacy plan, okay? So the last thing is I'd like you, and we're going to spend a little more time on this, is to think about in stage 2 on the handouts that are on the website, there's this model, and then there's 5 stages with bullet points underneath. So these are the bullet points for conduct a self-assessment and develop literacy action goals. So this is stage 2 of the process. Identify strengths. We spend some time having schools talk about the strengths of their school. Every school has strengths, and every school has strengths that can be built on to improve literacy. So we always start with strengths. You can come up with all kinds of things that you're not doing, but that's really not productive because then it shuts people down. You have to start with acknowledging what people do well and how you can build on that to improve literacy. We ask people to summarize their data because sometimes people don't believe that a literacy effort in the school is necessary, and sometimes some people don't feel like they're part of it or should be part of it. It's not my job, it's not my job to teach literacy. And so we need to help people see that it's everybody's job, and if everybody takes their part, it has more of an impact than 1 or 2 star teachers carrying the load. And then the third part is assessing implementation. And I'm going to show you how to use the rubrics, and you're free to use this rubric. And if you'll email me, I'd be happy to share. There are 5 rubrics, 6 rubrics. And then from that, you can draft goals. So here are the 6 rubrics, and they're around the goal areas of the model. So remember the model. Student motivation across the content areas, literacy interventions, school environment, parents and community, and district. We're going to talk about the literacy across the content area because that's the one that people gravitate to most often. But before I do, I want to talk about literacy interventions. So I'm guessing that there are some kids in your school that need special intervention in literacy, correct? What do you do for them? That's a real question. What interventions do you have in place for them? And the response to intervention with the Tier 1, the Tier 2, and Tier 3. In Florida, we don't even talk much about literacy interventions because the state has prescribed if you score this on this test, you do that. And if you score this on this test, you do this. Now, some people don't like to be told what to do with interventions, but the good news is that every single student who needs an intervention has something. Some of us have problems what they choose to do with interventions, like the highly scripted programs that kids get to do every single year over and over. But literacy interventions it's a formula, and all kids get an intervention. Other states, like I think yours, if I'm not wrong, the literacy intervention is up to the school or the district, correct? we worked in a school district in Pennsylvania, a middle and a high school, and the teachers chose to focus on a literacy-rich environment and literacy across the content area. So they worked on strategies in their content area, and they put up some posters in the library, and they had a book night and a parent night, and guess what? Their test scores were absolutely flat because the literacy goals they came up with were not high impact on the lives of students. So there will be some people in your buildings who would just as soon play with the posters in the library and call that literacy than really examine their classroom practice about whether or not they're supporting literacy in their classroom practice. So this part is really important. How do you choose, how do you have the conversations where you end up with literacy goals that have a high impact on student achievement? And while we're not going to talk a lot about it today, I really want you to think about this literacy intervention, because if you ignore it, then you're ignoring maybe a fourth of the students in your school that really need literacy interventions, that aren't going to really get it in content area classrooms. You want to talk about that for a minute? Do you have questions or comments about that? Do you see where I'm headed here? So, so you really, if you do not have an intervention program in your class, in your school, that should be one of your goals. Or you should at least have a plan for considering what to do for those kids. Yep. Can you say it a little bit louder, please?
12 years ago, people were really into pre-teaching in intervention classes, where if you had a content class, they would pre-teach the vocabulary itself before the students came to the classroom. I thought it was a great intervention, and I'm sitting here thinking we haven't done that. I haven't seen it in probably 12 years. Is anybody doing any pre-teaching?
All right, so pre-reading strategies, there's arguments on both sides. I think kids need to know what they're reading about, and especially kids like Jim need to have, they need to know what they're reading. They need to pre-teach the vocabulary. They need some concept explanations, and especially kids who don't have a lot of experiences outside of the classroom. Some people, especially since Common Core came out, and I know that you don't do Common Core, you do Ohio Core, but we do Florida Core, and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference too much. That pre-teaching, the argument against it is that pre-teaching robs kids of the opportunity to learn from text because you're telling them everything. So pre-teaching and pre-reading strategies have somewhat gotten a bad rap over the last 5 years because what you're doing is they say that teachers that use PowerPoints and tell kids everything that's in the book and then they never have to read it. So doing some sort of activity that builds kids' schema about what they're going to read is good. Telling them everything that's in the book might not be good because then they never actually have to read the book. My daughter did well in school because she was a really good note taker and a really good listener, and teachers told her everything that was in the book, so she never read it. And then she memorized everything, and she was a good memorizer, and she was a good test taker, and she did very well in high school, but when she got to college, she had a really tough time because college professors don't say, let me tell you everything that's in chapter 3. They say, read chapter 3 and we're going to discuss it tomorrow. That's sort of a roundabout answer to your question, but intervention programs should deal with helping kids become better readers by teaching them the strategies of proficient reading. Whether that is going back to phonemic awareness and phonics, or whether that's teaching them some comprehension strategies, or whether that is helping them see the structure of text so that they can negotiate it. So take a moment before we go on to literacy across the content areas and talk to your neighbor about what you do in your school for kids who need an intervention program. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the literacy across the content. I chose this rubric because it's the one that most people are interested in terms of translating it into a school-wide literacy plan. So it's in the handouts and it's on the downloaded web, and it's a rubric. And so the way that you use the rubric, across the top are 4 levels: little or no implementation, some implementation, consistent implementation, and strong, or what's the last column? Exemplary. When we wrote these rubrics, we started with level 4 because we said if you are at Nirvana Middle School, we want you to know what exemplary implementation of this particular indicator would look like, knowing that there wouldn't be a lot of people hanging around the 4 level. Then we went back and said, let's describe a level that at level 3, consistent implementation across the school. And what we said was, if you have consistent implementation, if you're at a level 3 with this particular indicator, it will make a difference for kids. So we're not expecting a lot of people to be at 4, but we wanted people to know what it looked like. And quite frankly, most schools are at 2s, or with some 1s, and maybe if there's a star teacher or department or whatever, they might be a 3. So don't get too discouraged if you're hanging out at the 2 level. Down the bottom are components of that particular goal area. So the first component for literacy across the content area is what happens in the classroom. And underneath that, what happens in the classroom are 4 different indicators, okay? So that's what the cells represent. So what I'd like for you to do, and this is going to take a little while, is I'd like for you to respond individually to the rubric. And when you're sitting with a literacy team, it's really important that you respond individually first. Because, what's your name? Carrie? Carrie is a real loudmouth. And Carrie is very opinionated. She's a wonderful teacher, and people really admire her teaching. But when she says something, people really listen. So if Carrie says first, I think we're at a level 2, then everybody else, especially some of the more timid teachers or new teachers, are going to just not think through that particular indicator. They're just going to go what Carrie has to say because she's been at the school for 20 years and she knows. Okay? That's why it's really important to respond individually before you go on as a team. Okay? So what I'd like you to do is start with level 4 and read across. And when you find the cell that describes what you think your school is, where your school is on that indicator, put a check mark on it. Now, you might say, I'm a social studies teacher and I don't know what anybody else does besides the social studies department. Or you might say, I'm a 6th grade teacher and I only am in 6th grade classrooms. I'm not like the literacy coach or the administrator that are in all classrooms. Rate it on what you know. You don't have to know everything about the whole school, and I'll show you why that's important later. So take a minute and put a check mark in each of the cells based on where you think your school lies on that particular indicator. Is that clear? Okay. So if you've now rated the rubric individually, discuss where does your school score the highest, 3 or 4. How many of you had 3s and 4s? Not a bunch? How about 2s? You had some 2s? Yes. Even dismay, 1? Couple 1s? Okay, so don't forget to talk about your strengths. And your strengths are the 3s and the 4s. And those strengths can be built upon. However, what ought to be getting your attention is there a clump of things that is falling in that level 2 area? When I say clump, can you put them together to make like an overarching goal? So would the overarching goal be something like every teacher will use literacy support strategies in the content area to improve literacy? Something like that, that is broad enough to hit every teacher in the school, but narrow enough to be measurable. And then I've seen some schools that actually go to the social studies department and say, we're going to talk about literacy support strategies. Which particular strategies do you want to use in social studies? Which particular strategies do you want to use in language arts? Because there may be some that lend themselves more to one content area or another. On the other hand, if there are some strategies, like graphic organizers, that you can use across the school, and the beauty of that is a student does a graphic organizer, like a Venn diagram, and goes to the next class, and that student already knows how to do a compare and contrast Venn diagram, then it reinforces across the content areas those literacy support strategies and those thinking strategies. What comments do you have about the rubric and what you found out about your school using the rubric? Was it helpful? Can you see that it could engender some conversation? Also, what some people do is put it on like a survey monkey and have everybody in the school rate the school. Then they use that as a data reference. And then so the literacy team then gets together and says, well, most of the school and all of the social studies department said this, and begin to develop goals from there. Okay, what questions do you have about using the rubric and using the rubric to come up with goals? It's crystal clear? Yeah? Okay. So we also have rubrics in these other areas that I would be happy to send you if you email me. And my email is on the front of all the handouts. So we have rubrics that are also in across the content areas: literacy intervention, student motivation, school environment, parents and community, and district. What we find working with schools is most people focus on student motivation and across the content area. For those of you who also are in K-8 schools or have some interest in elementary, we've also developed an elementary rubric, and if you want me to send you that, I would be happy to. Just email me so when I'm next to my computer and I can just send it as an attachment. Okay, any questions about the rubrics? So then the next step is, let me just describe the way we do it. You can take these materials and do it any way you want. What we have found is that the discussion of the rubric is the rich part of coming up with a goal that everybody can buy into. It doesn't matter what, that you rated a 1 and I rated a 2, but it's the discussion of how you rated it. So what we do is, so envision that this is a literacy team, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people on this literacy team. The tick marks represent each individual's perception of how they rated that particular cell or group of cells, indicators. So then you spend some time discussing the rubric with this team. You can do this by departments, by grade levels, by literacy team. So you say, somebody that rated it a low 1, can you tell me why? Well, in my experience, I don't see anybody using literacy support strategies. Somebody that rated it a high 2, can you tell me why? Well, we use them in language arts all the time, and we use thinking maps, and we use this, and we use that. And the discussion itself is a way to help people on the literacy team understand what is going on school-wide. Because teachers, they stay in their classroom, they talk to 3 other teachers, and they don't really have a feel for what else is going on. I was sitting with a principal and a teacher, and the teacher was going 4, 3, 4, 3, and the principal was going 1, 2, 1, and she said, I do all those things. And the principal turned around and said, and you're the only one. So it's helpful, especially if a literacy team is going to make decisions about what happens in the school, if they kind of understand what's going on school-wide and not just in their classroom or their department or their grade level. Okay? So, so what we do next is the dot represents consensus after discussion. So this discussion becomes important because it helps people on the team understand what's going on school-wide. That's why I say it's not so important whether you do a low 2 or a high 2 or a middle 2 or whatever. It's the discussion and the consensus point. So then you look at a graph like this, and this is not high-tech or, I mean, it's just simple. But then you say, this particular component seems to be a need area for us. So let's establish the need areas and write goals around those. Okay? So that's how we get from rubric to goals. So the next step is to draft literacy goals. Excuse me. How many goals should you have for your literacy plan? We say 2 to 4. And if you don't have a literacy intervention program, one of them should be around literacy interventions. And let me just say, if you don't have a literacy intervention program and you have kids that need it, that might take you a whole year to accomplish, but it's very, very important because you have to look at existing programs, resources including personnel, what kids need what. And that's a fairly complex one, but it's very important if you don't have one in your school. So we usually say 2 to 4 goals are manageable in a year. So take a minute and draft a goal from the rubric that you did, and let's talk about the language of goals and how to translate goals into an implementation map and eventually into a plan. Okay? Take a minute and draft a goal. I had a question about your leadership teams in your school and whether the leadership team can function as a literacy team. Absolutely. If they don't get distracted and talk about discipline and before school bus schedule and. So there needs to be some monitoring of the leadership team so that they're focusing on literacy. Because if they're used to coming together and talking about other things, they will continue to talk about other things unless they're truly focused on a literacy effort. Does that help? Okay. All right. Would anybody like to offer up a draft goal? I used to teach a class till 9:30 at night, and I would say, "Are there any questions?" And everybody would look around and say, "You raise your hands, I'll break your arm." You have a goal you'd like to offer up?
Sure. Given a school year's worth of time, teachers from all grade levels, content areas, and administrators will effectively meet, discuss, plan, and implement literacy into their classrooms on a weekly basis. 100%.
Okay. That's a fairly broad goal. So the content of it is that all teachers in the school will meet and discuss and develop a literacy plan across the school. That's a fairly broad goal. But thank you for offering that up so I could say that. I appreciate that. On the website, there's an implementation map, and this is the structure of it. But on the website, the goal is, as a sample that's in that book, is all literacy support. All content teachers will routinely use, literacy support strategies in every content area. That's a broad enough goal to encompass everybody, but specific enough to be measurable. The structure of these maps, now what we suggest is that you do an implementation map around each literacy goal. So the structure of it is you put your goal at the top and you start with action steps. So an action step for that goal might be that the literacy team identifies a group of common strategies. The second action step might be that all faculty engage in 2 professional development activities to learn about these strategies. Another action step might be that all departments engage in a discussion of literacy support strategies that are particularly useful in that content area. So those are all action steps. So once you do the action steps, then you slip over and you do the specifics. What would that look like? Bullet point. You'd have to do this, 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 and this. So this might take 2 hours to develop with a team of people. But once you have it done, you have a plan for the whole year. So say these first 2 rows are a literacy team. I'm going to say, you're going to work on goal 1, you're going to work on goal 2, and you're going to work on goal 3. And we're going to spend 2 hours, and we're going to do this kind of a literacy plan, this implementation map, and then we're going to share with each other and critique. So then you're going to present it, we're going to share it, and then that discussion turns out to be things like, I think we have to do this one before that one, and I don't think we can get that all done by October. Or I think we can push it up, and then after you get your implementation maps, you 3 are in charge of monitoring that particular goal. And you 3 monitor goal 2. And when we meet as a team, you report how that's going so that you can have more than one goal being implemented at any particular time. So those of you that have run it off or look at the website, there is how many of you have that in front of you, the implementation map? She has it on her phone. But this is the structure of the implementation map. So then you have to figure out what's the target dates, who are going to be the people involved, and what resources are needed. In my experience, I've been on literacy teams that do not have any sort of administrator or resource person on them, and teachers get into the discussion of we can't do that because, we can't do that because. And it usually is around resources. If there is an administrator or an assistant principal for curriculum or whoever that has some authority over resources, they can mitigate that negative behavior by saying, yeah, we can find the money to do, or maybe next year's plan we can put in, or, and they tend to be the problem solvers. Because without those problem solvers on the literacy team, teachers sometimes get into the yes buts. I'm sure that hasn't happened in your school. No yes butters in your schools. So, and sometimes it is a big resource, like we need to hire an intervention teacher. That's not going to happen tomorrow. That's maybe going to happen next year. But it should be on the horizon if that's something that's really important for your school. Okay. Without the implementation maps in front of you, it's really hard to respond to it. But I really would like for you to dig into that implementation maps. Can you get to it on your computers? Or she can. Bridget can get to it on her phone. I'm sorry?
What link is it on? Yep. If you go to the ODE, what's this called? Literacy Academy.
ODE Literacy Academy.
And then you click on this event, the middle school one. It's like 3/4 of the way down the page.
3/4 of the way down the page, click on the literacy event.
And then if you've got an iPhone, you can touch it, download it, and just open it in your files, and you can view it. It's a preview.
Item 5. The reason I say that is because the implementation map ends up being the meat and potatoes of the literacy plan. And this is just the structure of it, but the one that's on the website is a real middle school example with middle school action steps. And then the measures of success are things that you know that action step has been completed successfully. For example, all teachers will participate in 2 professional development around literacy support strategies. How do you know that that was successful? You have evaluations from the event. You have teachers' walkthroughs that you can see them actually implementing them in the classroom, right? Okay. Do you want a minute? Take a minute, see if you can download this action plan to see if you have any questions. And you should have 1 action plan per goal. Take a minute, see if you can at least get next to it with somebody there so that you can take a look at the action plan. The implementation map, there should be 1 per literacy goal. So what does a literacy plan look like? A little bit about here's our school and here's our literacy needs and here's the things we do well and here's the people that are on the committee. Here's our literacy action plan, here's our map. Here's our literacy goal, here's our map, here's our other goal, here's our map, okay? So, and remember that this is a living document that should be revised every year. In fact, it'll be revised at every literacy meeting because you'll sit down and say, we can't do this by October, or it's already October, and we haven't done that, so let's do this in January, etc., which is perfectly fine. And if you want me to send you a blank implementation map in a Word document, I'd be happy to do that. So how do you get these maps done? After you go through a process and identify what your goals are, then you sit down 2 or 3 around a goal, and I will tell you that doing a good implementation maps takes about 2 hours. You can do it on Google Docs. You can do it with a projection unit where 1 person types it, but everybody can see it, which is, we think, the best way, just because everybody can see it at the same time. Google Docs works as well. So that you can discuss it and do the action steps first, and then go over to the specifics, and then fill out the rest. And then make sure that your measures of success will tell you how do you know that you finished that successfully. So when you finish this implementation map, 1 per goal, you have a plan for the whole year about what your literacy team is doing. Because what are you doing next? You're monitoring the plan. What questions do you have about coming up with the implementation maps and how that goes together in the plan? I want to talk a little bit about faculty feedback. Okay, let me talk a little bit about feedback. If the literacy comes up and does a sterling job with all of these literacy action goals and comes up with these maps and hands them to the faculty, what's going to happen? Not much, right? So the literacy team owns it. How do you get faculty feedback and buy-in? So one of the things that we do is we say, especially after at different stages, so you make up your goals, and then you make up a feedback sheet that says, I can live with this goal, I really don't like this goal, I need help with this goal, please provide me with, or here's some suggestion for improving the goal. And then you honestly take those that feedback, whether it's in the form of sticky notes or a response sheet or a survey monkey or whatever else, however that comes, and then you actually, in good faith, modify your plan based on faculty feedback. Because if you don't have the faculty feedback, then it becomes your plan and not theirs. You also need to have representation on your literacy team, leadership team, whatever structure is best for you, to every part of the school. So as you're discussing the goals, then you can take them to departments or grade levels or whatever is the appropriate unit and get feedback on the goals and sit down and discuss them so that everybody can buy into those goals. So it's a process of literacy team meeting, coming up with something, saying, this is what we've come up with so far. What's your feedback? How can we make it better? Can you live with this? And it's a process of back and forth so that you actually have the feedback of the faculty. So talk for a minute with your colleagues about how you get feedback in your specific building around something new like this, like a literacy plan. So basically, one of the handouts on the website that says the 5 stages or something like that. So you have stage 1, which is getting ready. Remember we talked about that. Build a team or use a team, a designated team, however that happens. Create a vision and use data to establish the need. And from what I learned this morning, you've sort of already done that with your buildings, right? Stage 2, identify school strengths. Summarize key messages about your school data, assess current implementation using the rubrics, and draft your literacy action goals. So we've kind of talked through those pieces. That's stage 1 and 2. Stage 3 is develop an implementation map for each one of your goals. Solicit feedback from the entire school community. So we've talked a little bit about that. Based on that feedback, revise the implementation maps, and then publish the literacy action plan. And you can publish it on a website, however that happens for you. Quickly, stages 4 and 5 have to do with implementing the plan, monitoring the plan, and revising the plan. So you do have to have a mechanism for monitoring the plan. Who's in charge of seeing that the plan is being done? How do you go back and revise that? There's some tools in here having to do with progress towards goals and where are you and how do you need to revise it. So there's several tools in here where we suggest that ways of monitoring the plan. So that's pretty much the process of the literacy action planning process. Do you have questions on that? I sense you have a need to maybe find your colleagues and do some talking through and that kind of stuff, so I'm going to honor that. So trying new things is sometimes not a pretty sight. That's me. And my husband was so kind to take this picture. But this is why we do it, to improve student engagement with reading and writing across all content areas. So thank you for your kind attention. Let me give this book away. Does anybody have a... Oh, thank you. Does anybody have a birthday near today? Today's the 18th. January 25th. Anybody closer than 7 days away? Well, you are the proud owner of this book. Happy birthday. Thank you for your kind attention. I know you have a lot to do this afternoon and appreciate you being here.